Let me ask you a question. What do you think is the second largest waste stream in the entire United States? The answer? Well, it might surprise you. Today, we're diving into what happens when the structures built to contain this stuff fail. And I mean fail in a big, big way.
1 billion gallons. That's a billion with a B. Back in 2008, that was the scale of America's single largest industrial spill. But this disaster wasn't what you're probably picturing.
Nope, it wasn't oil. It was coal ash, the toxic stuff left over after you burn coal for electricity. And this is the story of what happens when a 50-foot wall of that industrial waste just gives way, burying absolutely everything in its path.
All right, let's get into it. First things first, we really need to understand what this material even is, and more importantly, why so much of it was being stored in such a risky way to begin with. So for decades, as power plants burned coal, they created these mountains of ash. And the disposal method was, well, pretty simple. You just mix it with water to make this thick slurry, and then you pump it into these gigantic, unlined ponds, often built right next to rivers and towns.
And that exact method of storage, well, it was basically setting the stage for a disaster of truly historic proportions at a facility out in eastern Tennessee.
Picture this. It's 1 in the morning, just a few days before Christmas. And at the Tennessee Valley Authority's Kingston fossil plant, a catastrophic failure is starting. An entire containment pond, holding back millions of tons of this toxic sludge, is literally breaking apart.
Now here's the thing. This wasn't totally out of the blue. There were warning signs, clear as day. Consultants had pointed out small failures in the dikes years before, but inspections kept happening, and even on the very day of the collapse, a visual check said everything was fine. And then, it all just gave way with shocking speed.
The scale of this thing is almost impossible to wrap your head around. A wave of thick gray sludge, so powerful it surged across an entire river, burying 300 acres of land. It didn't just damage homes, it ripped them right off their foundations and severed major infrastructure like gas lines and railways.
So how on earth could this happen? Well, investigators found it was basically a textbook recipe for disaster. The dikes themselves were built on a weak, unstable layer of silt. Then, year after year, as they produced more ash, they just built the walls higher and higher, adding incredible pressure. The old ash at the bottom got completely waterlogged and weak until finally, the foundation just couldn't take it anymore.
But the impact of the spill wasn't just the physical damage you could see. It left this deep, lasting psychological scar on the entire community.
Researchers who studied the aftermath found that this wasn't just about the initial shock of the event. No, the spill created this state of chronic, long-term stress. It was fueled by years of uncertainty about health risks, about the environment, and really about the future of their own community. And you can actually see that stress in the numbers. This is fascinating. A study in 2011 compared residents of Roane County, where the spill happened, to folks in a neighboring county, and the results were just stark. Roane County residents experienced more than double the level of disaster-related stress.
And what makes that kind of stress so much worse? It's when you feel like you can't trust the very institutions that are supposed to be protecting you. The residents felt completely let down, especially by the TVA, the agency that ran the plant, but also by the government bodies that were supposed to be overseeing the whole cleanup.
Now, what's truly disturbing about all this is that the Kingston disaster, it wasn't a one-off. The same fundamental risks were sitting there waiting at hundreds of similar sites all across the country.
Yep, 6 years later, hundreds of miles away in North Carolina, it happened again. This time, it wasn't the wall of a dike that failed, but a stormwater pipe that collapsed right underneath a massive coal ash pond.
And this right here illustrates the problem perfectly. When you look at these two images side by side, you're seeing two different sites run by two different companies in two different states, but with a frighteningly similar outcome. A river just choked with that same toxic gray sludge. Now, okay, the Dan River spill was smaller than Kingston, but its impact was still enormous. We're talking nearly 40,000 tons of ash poisoning a huge stretch of the river. And they found toxic materials like arsenic and lead mixed in with the river sediment as far as 70 miles downstream. 70 miles! So, after two of the biggest industrial spills in U.S. history, both involving the exact same material, what have we actually learned from all this sludge? Well, a pretty scathing investigation by the TVA's own Inspector General. After Kingston, it revealed a corporate culture that was deeply flawed.
For years, the agency had basically treated this hazardous waste like it was nothing more than household garbage.
And it gets worse. The report also found that after the spill, the agency's #1 priority was its legal defense. Not public transparency, not accountability. They were more worried about their litigation strategy than being open with the very community they had just devastated.
But there was a silver lining, if you can call it that. The huge public outcry and the political pressure from these disasters finally forced some real action. Both North Carolina and the federal government passed new, much stricter rules for how coal ash has to be managed.
But here's the thought I want to leave you with. The legacy of all those years of coal power, it isn't gone. It's sitting right there in vulnerable ponds and landfills all across the United States. And that leaves us with a pretty critical question. Have we truly done enough to prevent the next Kingston or the next Dan River?